There are places where history seems too thin, like a curtain stretched over something much larger than it wants to reveal. Malta is one of them. The stones rise older than the pyramids, yet the people who are meant to place them appear centuries too late, as if a chapter was torn from the island's memory. And in that quiet absence, myths began to seep in. Stories of a giantess named Sansuna, carrying megaliths across the land before humans learned their own strength. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what is whispered here. And if you're listening now, share where you are in the world and what time the night has found you. The stillness that surrounds Malta's megalithic temples often feels like the silence that follows a forgotten name. No one knows who built Gantija, Manadra, Hegarsim, or why their layout seems to echo astronomical alignment seen in cultures thousands of miles apart. Archaeologists describe these places as the work of Neolithic islanders who appeared suddenly, built impossibly sophisticated temples, and then vanished with equal haste. Yet even in the most generous reconstructions, the timeline does not quite fit. Radiocarbon dates push the temples back to around 3600 BCE, but the earliest traces of permanent habitation appear to arrive after 5900 BCE, leaving a disquieting gap between arrival and achievement. It is as if the island moved from silence to mastery without the necessary steps in between, like a book beginning at its middle page. Malta's own myth keepers fill the silence with giants. Sansuna, sometimes described as a solitary builder, other times as one of a vanished race, was said to carry stones large enough to make even the island's cliff seem small. In one version, she is seen walking from the coast with a slab balanced on her shoulder, placing it gently upon others with no more strain than a person might feel when arranging cushions on a bed. These stories, at first glance, appear to belong to the realm of bedtime tales. But myths do not persist for millennia without attaching themselves to something deeper, something people once believed they saw with their own eyes. Why would a tiny island imagine its origins through beings of impossible size unless memory itself was pointing towards something the official story could not comfortably hold? Even early scholars noticed how peculiar Malta's myths were. The giant stories appear not as exaggerated metaphors but as matter-of-fact explanations offered by villagers to 19th century ethnographers. When asked who built the temples, they simply shrugged. The giants built them. No embarrassment, no hesitation. As though this knowledge was not an invention but an inheritance. The first British antiquarians who documented the island's megaliths wrote of proportions that seemed out of scale with a small Neolithic population. The lintels, the corbelled roofs, the megalithic walls, all were described using words like colossal, monumental, inhuman in ambition. Some noted that the block's weight exceeded what rope and wood technology could realistically manage on a limestone island without abundant timber. Others remarked on the polished inner chambers, their acoustics, the deliberate geometry, and in private letters, a few even whispered that earlier excavations had reported bones strangely elongated or unusually tall, though these claims slipped out of official reports and into the space where rumor and deletion meet. Perhaps that is why standing before the temples evokes a strange quiet, the kind that suggests something was removed not just from the stones, but from the story of the people behind them. The more one studies the timeline, the more the gaps feel intentional. How did a small population, living on an island with limited natural resources, develop architectural concepts that required mathematical foresight, social organization, and labor on a scale rarely seen in the Neolithic world? Why does this stylistic evolution seem so abrupt, with no gradual build-up? Malta's temples appear not as the peak of a long tradition, but as the sudden arrival of mastery. And when such mastery appears without context, it tends to leave the scent of earlier, unseen hands. Some archaeologists attempt to smooth the narrative by suggesting that earlier settlements simply eroded or remain undiscovered. It is possible. Limestone dissolves easily. Coastal changes can erase entire landscapes, yet the absence still carries weight. Entire phases of development, initial experimentation, failed structures, half-formed architectural traditions are missing. Instead, the first surviving temples show complexity that should only appear late in a cultural sequence. It is like finding the ruins of a cathedral, but no trace of the village that learned to stack stones. This sense of an interrupted or edited past creates the atmosphere that has always surrounded Malta. Travelers who arrived in the early 20th century spoke of an island where history felt thin and rumor felt thick. The temples were recognized as extraordinary, but the explanations offered felt incomplete, too neat, too restrained. Tourists asked guides about the giants, and the guides laughed politely, though their eyes shifted toward the stones as if trying to recall stories older than the language they now spoke. What complicates everything further is that Malta does not just hold megaliths on the surface. It holds an entire world beneath, an underground architecture that seems to breathe with even older silence. But that deeper world, the hypogeum of Halsafleani, cannot yet be entered in this part of the story. Its chambers, its acoustics, its vanished bones, and its disappearing records belong to a later descent. Before entering the underworld beneath Malta, one must understand the island's first wound, the contradiction of a people who appear too late to explain what they left behind. It is this contradiction that keeps returning, like an echo from a corridor that refuses to be mapped. If the first builders were not the Neolithic Maltese, then who stood here long before them? If the myths of Sansuna are more memory than metaphor, then what kind of beings walked this island when the land was younger and the sea had not yet claimed what it has taken now? And if history avoids these questions, who, exactly, benefits from the avoidance? Somewhere in these early discrepancies lies a thread that will eventually lead downward into chambers carved in darkness and stories that resurfaced only to be quietly set aside. But for now, the surface alone already feels uneasy, as though the island itself is waiting for someone to ask the question it has carried for thousands of years. Night settles differently over Malta's temples, lingering along the edges of the stones as if light itself hesitates to leave them. And in that lingering dimness, one begins to notice something unusual about the island, the way its landscape seems to remember what the written record forgets. The first contradiction has already been whispered. The people arrived, the mastery appeared, and the steps in between fell away. Yet the more one walks across Malta's scorched limestone, the more that contradiction expands, spreading like a slow tide across every megalithic site, as if the island were gently insisting that its past was not as clean as the textbooks would like to suggest. If one begins at Guntiyangoso, the sensation grows stronger. The name itself means the place of giants, not because scholars imposed the label, but because the local inhabitants said it had belonged to giants long before archaeology tried to replace stories with chronology. The structure rises in heavy curves, like the ribcage of some ancient creature turned into stone. Its outer walls contain blocks weighing more than 50 tons, arranged with a precision that feels too deliberate to be improvised. The interior layout follows a pattern seen nowhere else in Europe at the time. Apses shaped like leaves, altars carved with spirals, and architectural choices hinting at cosmological ideas that normally require centuries of cultural development. Yet here they appear without precedent, without prototypes, without a lineage. When early excavators cleared sections of Gamtesia in the 1820s, they wrote of discovering strange bones, though their accounts drifted into scattered notes instead of preserved reports. A few described skulls, elongated beyond the ordinary, but these claims were treated as embarrassments, quickly tucked away. By the late 1800s, the bones themselves were no longer available for examination. Some said they had disintegrated. Others said they had been moved and misplaced. and others still believe that certain finds have simply been deemed inconvenient for the emerging narrative of European prehistory, which favored continuity, not anomalies. Further south, at Monastra, the silence grows heavier. The temple complex aligns with the rising sun during equinoxes and solstices. Light filters through the entrance at an angle that illuminates specific stones only on specific days. Today, archaeologists call this ritual architecture, but the precision suggests more than ritual. It suggests a knowledge of solar cycles requiring generations of careful observation, the kind of knowledge expected from a culture with a deep astronomical tradition. Yet the Neolithic inhabitants of Malta, according to official timelines, left no trace of such a tradition outside the temples themselves. If they did possess this expertise, why does it appear suddenly and vanish just as suddenly? Why does it not evolve, expand, or influence later Mediterranean societies? Why does it remain sealed within stones as though preserved from a people who themselves dissolved into the air? Hagoseum, overlooking the sea, provides another layer of unease. From a distance, its stones resemble a toppled constellation, each block shaped by weather and intention. Up close, the precision of the cuts becomes evident. Smooth surfaces, beveled edges, doorways carved with mathematical symmetry. Some stones contain circular holes that frame distant horizons as if acting as sightlines. Scholars propose astronomical functions, though others describe them as ritual windows. Yet even that explanation feels thin, as if a deeper purpose were kept at arm's length. Visitors often remark that the temples feel older than their assigned dates. This is not a scientific observation, but an instinctive one. Something about their weathering suggests a longer passage of time, as though the island itself aged around them. Some geologists note that the erosion on exposed surfaces seems unusually advanced for structures supposedly only 6,000 years old. Erosion can be misleading, of course. Limestone is soft, vulnerable to sea winds and salt. But the sensation persists. The stones carry more years than the official record allows. Then there is the cultural puzzle. Malta's temples do not resemble the architecture of its nearest neighbors. They do not mimic North African styles. They do not reflect early Mediterranean coastal settlements. They stand alone, without relatives, without lineage. Cultures rarely emerge in isolation. Ideas travel with people, tools migrate with merchants, styles blend across shores, but the Maltese megalithic builders appear like a whisper from a forgotten branch of humanity. Skilled, organized, knowledgeable, yet completely absent from the surrounding archaeological web. How does a culture this advanced leave no genetic or cultural trail? How does its knowledge fail to diffuse across islands that lie along ancient trade routes? Unless, of course, the culture did not emerge here but was preserved here, like an echo trapped in stone. By the late 19th century, a few scholars began asking uncomfortable questions. Some pointed to the unusual proportions of temple entrances and raised the idea that the builders might have been larger-bodied. Others noted that the temples seemed designed for taller individuals, doorways higher than typical Neolithic structures, altars placed at heights awkward for smaller people. These observations were quietly criticized, mocked, or dismissed as romantic speculation. And yet the same scholars who dismissed them could not explain why similar myths existed across the region. Sardinia had its giants' tombs. The Balearic Islands told of stone lifters. Crete had its giant guardians. Even the biblical Rephaim and Anatolian myths of ancient toll builders formed a pattern. Wherever megaliths rose, stories of giants followed like shadows. Patterns alone prove nothing, but they suggest that collective memory sometimes outlives written records. And Malta's collective memory speaks of beings far older and stronger than the island's later inhabitants. Beings who molded the landscape before the sea levels rose, before the island was cut off from the mainland, before the world settled into the shape we now recognize. If the myths contain even a fragment of truth, then Malta may hold remnants of a pre-flood or pre-Holocene culture, whose traces survived only because the island's limestone protected what would otherwise have been lost. The archaeological establishment resists such interpretations, and reasonably so. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, yet the absence of evidence can sometimes be its own form of evidence, especially when the gaps appear too consistent to be accidental. Why did certain bones vanish? Why were early excavation records incomplete or contradictory? Why were unusual finds deemed unimportant or misclassified? The simplest answer is human error, but the most persistent answer is unease. Unease that the island's story is older, stranger, and less compatible with accepted frameworks than anyone wants to admit. Walking through these temples at dusk, one senses that they were not simply places of worship but markers, anchors of a memory now frayed. They stand like the exposed edges of a buried continent, waiting for someone patient enough to ask the questions they embody. And if the surface temples feel ancient, what does that suggest about the world lying beneath them? What does the landscape hide in its riddled limestone heart, where tunnels twist beyond mapped chambers and whispers of impossible discoveries continue to surface then fade? The land remembers, even when the records do not. There's a kind of quiet that gathers around old myths, the kind that does not fade even when centuries pass. Malta's story has already revealed its first fractures, timelines that do not meet, stones that seem older than their assigned age, and an island that remembers what history forgets. But within these fractures sits a figure who refuses to leave the narrative, no matter how many times she is pressed into the margins. Sansuna, the giantess of Malta, stands like a shadow behind the temples, a presence felt even when unspoken. And the more carefully one looks at the surviving myths, the more her silhouette seems less like fantasy and more like memory blurred by time. In the oldest version of her story, Sansuna was not a monster, not a creature of chaos, but a builder. She carried megaliths to Gozo, placing them with steady hands. Some villagers said she lifted stones from the sea itself, walking ashore with the weight of the earth resting lightly on her shoulder. Others claimed she was the last of a race that lived on Malta long before human settlement. She was tall beyond measure, strong beyond comprehension, yet described with a kind of familiar tenderness, almost as though the people who told the story believed they descended from her, or at least lived in the lingering wake of her existence. Legends of giant builders are not unique to Malta. Sardinia's Nuragic civilization left behind structures so large that later inhabitants named them giants' tombs. In the British Isles, the builders of Stonehenge were once said to be giants before scholars reframed the story. Across Anatolia, myths spoke of great beings shaping mountains and carving fortresses from stone. Even in the Levant, the Rephaim and Anakim were described as ancient peoples of great stature, associated with fortified cities whose construction seemed beyond what was expected of the known Bronze Age populations. These scattered stories form a strange constellation, separate cultures, distant landscapes, yet repeating the same motif, giants linked to megalithic architecture. If they all imagined the same impossible beings, what collective impulse drove them? And why are these stories so often anchored to structures whose origins still confuse modern scholarship? Malta's myth of Sansuna carries curiosities that rarely appear in purely symbolic tales. In one version, she is said to have eaten broad beans while she worked, a detail almost mundane in its simplicity. In another, she lived alone with her child, suggesting not a monstrous race, but a dwindling one. These small, ordinary touches are what make folklorists pause. Myths that exist purely as metaphor tend to exaggerate. Myths rooted in memory often shrink extraordinary beings into something human enough to tell stories about. Why would villagers describe what she ate, how she walked, how she rested? Why would they speak of her as a worker rather than a god, a presence rather than a legend? Unless perhaps the story began as an attempt to make sense of something the later inhabitants did not understand. temples too large to be built by people like themselves. Even early ethnographers noted this unease. When they asked locals who raised the massive stones, the answers came without hesitation. The giants built them. No one offered alternative theories. No one spoke of unknown tribes or forgotten settlers. They simply repeated what had always been told. And while modern archaeology tends to separate myth from history, it is worth remembering that before writing existed, myth was the archive. Stories preserved what tools could not, and legends carried echoes of events long lost to erosion and time. In many cultures, giants represent ancestors, beings who shaped the world before the arrival of smaller humans. If Malta's myth follows this pattern, then Sansuna may not be a fantasy, but a symbol of a people whose traces were absorbed into the stone. Yet the discomfort around these legends extends beyond academic caution. When Malta's temples were excavated, early reports occasionally mentioned skeletal remains that seemed unusual. The stories are inconsistent, the records incomplete, but the pattern persists. Bones described as larger than average, skulls elongated or thickened, features that raised questions but never found their place in official accounts. These details slipped from the published literature, appearing instead in letters, memoirs, or secondary writings. Some researchers suggested that the bones likely belonged to individuals with medical conditions. Others said they were misidentified animal remains, and still others argued that the entire narrative was fueled by imagination, nothing more. But the disappearance of the bones themselves left a hollow space, one that myth has filled more readily than archived evidence. When the myths of Sansuna are compared to the structures she is said to have built, a strange coherence emerges. The temple's doorways are unusually tall, the ceiling height to accommodate beings larger than the average Neolithic human. Some altars stand at heights awkward for individuals of typical stature. Polished floors show wear patterns suggesting individuals with considerable weight. These are observations, not conclusions, and each has a perfectly reasonable archaeological explanation. But when combined with the legend, they create a quiet pressure, a sense that perhaps the mismatch between myth and evidence is narrower than it initially seems. If Sansuna is merely symbolic, why does the architecture appear calibrated to her proportions? If the myth is pure invention, why does it map so neatly onto physical structures that predate all recorded storytelling on the island? Then there is the question of origin. Malta's temples do not resemble the architecture of cultures known to have influenced the Mediterranean Neolithic. Their curved apses, spiral decorations, and interior chambers do not fit into the stylistic evolution expected from village-based societies. They appear fully formed, with no experimental versions or earlier prototypes. This sudden emergence echoes the myth of a single builder, a giantess who did not evolve her techniques through generations, but simply built with knowledge already whole. Myths often compress time, but they rarely invent structure. If Sansuna represents an older culture, one capable of shaping enormous blocks with ease, perhaps the myth arose not from imagination, but from memory in its final, fading decades. Anthropologists studying oral tradition note that stories about vanished peoples often contain veiled warnings or loss. Sansuna's narrative ends with her disappearance, sometimes returning to the sea, sometimes walking into the hills until she is seen no more. In each version, the theme is the same. She leaves, and something essential leaves with her. After her departure, ordinary people remain, unable to emulate what came before. The temples become relics, their purpose forgotten. The island grows quiet, and what was once clear becomes myth. If Sansuna is a metaphor for cultural collapse, then perhaps the myth encodes the memory of a population bottleneck, a moment when the knowledge to build such temples vanished abruptly, leaving survivors who remembered the structures but not the skills behind them. If she represents a real group, then a story may point toward visitors or inhabitants with physical traits distinct enough to be mythologized by later populations. If she's an echo of something older than the Holocene, might she hint at a deeper layer of Mediterranean prehistory, erased by rising seas and preserved only in fragments? Even now, standing at the edge of Gigantiger at twilight, one can almost imagine the shape of something tall moving between the stones, not as a monster, but as a remnant of an earlier world. And if a figure truly walked here long before the current timeline begins, what does it say about the island's deeper secrets, the ones that lie beneath, waiting in the dark? There are places where the air itself feels altered, as if something beneath the surface has been breathing slowly for millennia. After lingering with Sunsuna's shadow and the uneasy memories woven into Malta's stones, the next step in this descent seems almost inevitable. Everything above ground, every block, every myth, every fragment of vanished chronology, keeps gesturing toward the world below, a world carved not by weather, but by intention. And if the temples feel like echoes, then the underground feels like a pulse, quiet, steady, and inexplicably old. It is here, beneath the soil of Paula, that the apogum of House Efliani waits, a structure that seems less built than revealed, as if the island opened itself to expose a memory it could not contain. The first impression of the apogum is not visual but spatial. Visitors describe the sensation of stepping into a thickness, an almost liquid stillness. Even in modern guided tours, restricted to small groups and timed exposure, people emerge speaking of an odd pressure on the chest, a subtle shift in balance, a feeling of being pulled slightly inward. These reactions are typically explained by humidity, temperature, or the psychology of enclosed spaces. Yet the reports remain persistent enough to warrant attention. There is something about the hypogeum that does not mirror ordinary underground chambers. It behaves differently, it sounds different, it feels different. Discovered accidentally in 1902 during the construction of a cistern, the hypogeum initially confounded the workers who broke into its upper chamber. They expected a simple natural cavity. Instead, they found deliberately carved walls, smooth surfaces, and a system of passages that seemed to move downward in deliberate stages. As excavations continued, the structure expanded into something far larger than anyone anticipated. Multiple levels, interconnected chambers, polished red ochre paintings, altars, niches, passages only accessible by crawling, and spaces where sound behaved with almost surgical precision. The deeper one goes, the more the hypogeum resists classification. Archaeologists call it a sanctuary, a necropolis, a ritual complex. None of those words quite fit. A sanctuary implies worship. The hypogeum feels more like an interface. A necropolis implies the dead. Yet its design is not merely funerary but acoustic, architectural, intentional, in ways that suggest an understanding of resonance and spatial manipulation. The word temple feels insufficient. The word tomb feels misleading. The structure behaves as if it were crafted to shape human perception, or perhaps to alter states of awareness. Even the earliest excavators sensed its peculiarity. Manuel Magri, the first archaeologist assigned to investigate the site, documented unusual finds. Bones stacked in deliberate arrangements, skulls with elongation that he described cautiously, stone tools arranged with care, and chambers whose acoustic behavior seemed intentional rather than accidental. Magri's reports were often ambiguous, partly because the excavation progressed quickly, and partly because early archaeological methods lacked the rigor of later decades. But the most unsettling aspect of Magri's involvement is not his descriptions. It is the fact that he died under mysterious circumstances before he could publish his full findings. After his death, parts of his notes reportedly vanished, leaving later scholars to reconstruct his work through fragments. What remains of the early documentation paints a picture of a place that unsettled even those who studied it professionally. Workers spoke of hearing strange echoes, voices that bounced but did not return in expected ways. Some claim that whispers from one chamber could be heard distinctly in another, while spoken words dissolved before reaching the next room. One chamber in particular, later named the Oracle Room, produces a resonance at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency known in modern acoustic studies to influence the human nervous system. Whether this effect was intentional or incidental remains unknown, but its existence casts a long shadow. How could a Neolithic culture with limited tools carve a chamber whose acoustic precision rivals modern engineering? How did they test it? And why did they require such a room beneath the earth? The walls of the hypogeum add another layer of strangeness. In certain chambers, spirals and honeycomb-like patterns appear in red ochre, painted with a care that suggests symbolism now lost to time. Some scholars propose fertility rituals. Others propose dream practices or shamanic ceremonies. Still others argue that the spirals echo a symbolic language shared across prehistoric Europe. Yet none of these explanations fully capture the depth of the environment. These are not random decorations. They're placed where the geometry of the chamber amplifies or softens sound, as if visual and acoustic meaning were intertwined. If the hypogeum was meant to guide participants through altered states of consciousness, then its architecture may represent one of the oldest examples of sound-based ritual engineering. But beneath the official interpretations lies a quieter narrative, one that echoes the myths explored earlier. Early accounts mention skeletal remains that seemed unusual, skulls elongated naturally, not artificially, jaw structures described as robust, proportions that sparked quiet debate among observers. These descriptions rarely appear in official publications after the mid-20th century. Some say the bones were lost during transfers between institutions. Others say they were removed intentionally to avoid sensational claims, and others argue that they were misinterpreted by early researchers overwhelmed by the sheer volume of remains, over 7,000 individuals in total. Yet it is difficult to ignore how often such anomalies appear, in conjunction with megalithic structures worldwide. Sardinia's giant graves, the elongated skulls of Paracas, the tall skeletons of North American mound cultures described in 19th century newspapers. Each case is controversial, each contested, yet the pattern persists. And Malta, sitting at the crossroads of ancient Mediterranean networks, seems to hold its own version of the mystery, buried in a labyrinth carved from living rock. What makes the hypogeum particularly enigmatic is not just the bones, nor the acoustics, nor the paintings. It is the sense of design. Nothing here seems improvised. The chambers descend in stages, almost like levels of initiation. Narrow passages lead to open caverns. Small niches open onto chambers whose proportions mimic the architecture of surface temples, as if the builders replicated their structures underground for a purpose that has not survived. Some researchers propose that the hypogeum mirrors the cosmological belief system of its creators, an inversion of the surface world, a descent into origins, a ritual movement between life and death. But others sense something older, a memory of a time when the island's underground spaces served as refuge, habitation, or archive. It is tempting to see the hypogeum as a tomb. It is tempting to see it as a temple. But perhaps it is neither. Perhaps it is the last remaining trace of a knowledge system that the island once held, a system preserved beneath the earth because the surface world had already begun to forget. And if the surface temples seem to hint at a vanished people, what does it mean that their deepest and most intricate structure lies hidden below, carved into darkness with a precision that even modern engineers find difficult to replicate? Could this be the true repository of whatever Malta tried to remember, and whatever later history tried to gently obscure? If the stoned above whisper of giants, what does the silence below suggest about the beings who carved it, and what they hoped the island would never allow to rise again? There is a moment when exploring the hypogeum in thought rather than in person, when the silence beneath Malta begins to feel too heavy to ignore. Myths have already blurred into archaeology, and timelines have shown their fractures, but the next layer of the descent brings with it something more unsettling. fragments of physical evidence that once existed, once were catalogued, and then, piece by piece, slipped from both display cases and written accounts. Bones that should not exist, or perhaps more accurately, bones that should not exist within the narrow frame allowed for Malta's Neolithic story. And yet they did, and then they did not. In the early years of the Hypogeum's excavation, when Manuel Magri and later Themistocles Zamet studied its chambers, thousands of human remains were recovered. The sheer volume suggested that the site served as a vast mortuary over centuries. Among these remains, certain skulls were noted in parsing by early observers as elongated, abnormally shaped, or unusually large. These descriptions appeared sporadically in handwritten notes, letters, or unpublished field reports, never in the polished official publications that followed. What made these skulls remarkable was not simply their size, but their structure. Some were described as having pronounced cranial vaults, thicker brow ridges, and an unusual elongation that did not match the typical characteristics of known Mediterranean populations. It is important to understand that elongation in skulls is not inherently extraordinary. In many parts of the world, artificial cranial deformation, achieved through binding infants' heads, was a ritual practice. But Malta's elongated skulls were described as natural, not shaped. They lacked the telltale flattening or symmetrical pressure marks associated with cultural modification. Instead, early observers hinted that the morphology was biological, perhaps a variant lineage or an isolated genetic expression. These observations were cautious, as if the writers themselves did not know how to interpret what they saw. What happened next is what fuels the island's long shadow of controversy. By the time the Hypogeum was formally catalogued and its artifacts prepared for museum display in the mid-20th century, the elongated skulls had vanished. Requests for their location were met with vague responses. They had been transferred, they were misplaced, they were too fragile, they no longer existed. A few photographs that once circulated among researchers have not been publicly displayed for decades. The official stance today is that no such anomalous skulls exist, and that any reports of them reflect misinterpretation or exaggeration by early excavators. Yet the pattern is troubling, not because it proves anything definitive, but because it repeats itself around the world. Bones that challenge the established timeline appear, are debated quietly, then fade into storage rooms, private collections, or footnotes that eventually disappear from reprints. In Malta's case, the disappearance feels even heavier, because the Hypogeum itself is a riddle carved in stone, and the removal of anything that might give voice to its builders leaves only the geometry of silence behind. Some scholars propose that the skulls never existed at all, that they were figments of imagination or distortions of memory. And yet, if they were merely misinterpreted remains, why do references to them appear in unrelated accounts across decades? Why do descriptions align across multiple sources that likely had no contact with each other? Why were they not simply studied and dismissed? Why did they need to be removed from sight? There are medical explanations, of course, conditions that can elongate skulls naturally, but even these cannot fully account for the number of remains reportedly found, nor the consistency in their descriptions. And if these skulls represent a genetic minority within a broader population, what does that say about the people who used the Hypogeum? What does it say about Malta's earliest inhabitants, the ones we still cannot identify through material culture alone? The deeper the Hypogeum goes, the more its architecture seems designed for a people who did not match the average proportions of Neolithic Europeans. Doorways vary dramatically in height. Some chambers force a modern visitor to crouch, while others seem sized for someone larger than expected. It may all be symbolic or driven by ritual needs, but the variation raises questions. Were these spaces designed for different kinds of bodies, or was the Hypogeum meant to function for a population whose physical traits are now lost to time? Even the placement of bones inside the Hypogeum creates tension with accepted narratives. Some were found stacked, some scattered, some arranged. Certain clusters suggest secondary burial, others suggest ritual separation. The remains were not placed haphazardly, they followed patterns. But patterns require intention, and intention requires knowledge. If the people who used the hypogeum had a sophisticated mortuary system, why is there no corresponding record of their living settlements, their workshops, their daily tools? Why do we find their dead in abundance but their living almost nowhere? The mystery deepens when considering what was not found. No weapons, no signs of conflict, no images of war or domination. Whoever used the hypogeum lived in a world that left little trace of violence. This absence has been interpreted as evidence of a peaceful society. But it can also suggest something else entirely, that the people buried here were not the builders, but inheritors, using a structure that already existed before them. And if they did inherit it, who taught them the rituals associated with the chambers? Who showed them the acoustics of the oracle room? Who instructed them in the use of red ochre symbols, spirals, and honeycomb patterns? The possibility that the hypogeum records more than one population, one older, one younger, cannot be dismissed entirely. Archaeologists acknowledge that the site was used over many centuries, possibly for different purposes at different times. But the idea that the earliest builders may have differed physically or culturally from the later burials has never been fully explored in mainstream discourse. It lingers in the margins, in footnotes, in quiet conversations among researchers who notice inconsistencies but lack the evidence to pursue them. And then there is the question of ritual sound. The 110 Hz resonance of the oracle chamber interacts differently with different body sizes, chest cavities, and skull shapes. Some researchers note that taller individuals with larger cranial volume would have experienced the resonance more intensely. The hypogeum, therefore, may have been tuned, acoustically shaped, for voices that no longer exist on the island. If so, then the architecture may carry clues not only to the minds of its builders, but to the bodies that shaped it. All of these elements, the missing bones, the architectural proportions, the acoustic anomalies, the abrupt disappearance of a people capable of shaping stone with such precision, form a constellation that resists simple explanations. The hypogeum holds its secrets with the patience of stone, and perhaps with the indifference of time. The official record is orderly, controlled, and confident. The underground reality, however, feels fragmented, hesitant, and strangely aware of its own contradictions. It is in these contradictions that the mystery of Malta deepens. If the bones that once raised questions truly existed, what story were they beginning to tell before they slipped away? And if the hypogeum once held evidence of a people unlike those who came after, what else might still lie buried in the levels below, waiting for a time when questions are permitted to be asked again? There is a moment when, standing inside the hypogeum, whether in memory, imagination, or the dim recollections recorded by those who descended there, when sound itself begins to behave like a living presence. It does not travel in straight lines. It does not return the way it should. It lingers, folds, and reshapes itself, as if the air has been persuaded into serving a purpose older than the chamber's present darkness. After the questions that rose above ground and the vanished bones left in Pot 5's shadow, the next layer of understanding does not lie in physical structure at all, but in vibration. Because in the hypogeum, sound is not decoration, it is architecture. The oracle chamber, carved with smooth precision into the limestone, is unlike any known space from the Neolithic world. When a person speaks within it, the sound resonates at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that modern psychoacoustics identifies as capable of inducing shifts in human perception. Researchers have described the resonance as creating a sensation of expansion in the chest, a vibrating fullness in the skull, and a subtle disorientation, neither unpleasant nor harmful, but undeniably transformative. Some visitors have described it as though the chamber itself was speaking back, completing their words. Others say it dissolves the boundary between sound and silence, leaving only a hum that seems to come from deep within the stone. Modern acoustic studies reveal that 110 Hz is a frequency associated with altered states, meditative depth, trance, or the loosening of ordinary cognitive boundaries. In certain music traditions, particularly those rooted in droning tones or overtone chanting, resonance near this frequency is used to shift awareness. That the hypogeum produces it naturally, through geometry alone, raises a question far more unsettling than any mystery of missing bones. How did a Neolithic society with no written mathematics and no documented knowledge of acoustics carve a chamber tuned to such a precise effect? Some scholars argue that the chamber's resonance could be accidental. Limestone is variable, and ancient stoneworkers might have carved until they found a sound that pleased them aesthetically. But this explanation feels thin when considering the broader design. The hypogeum contains multiple chambers shaped with curvature, smooth surfaces, and proportions that suggest acoustic intentionality. The oracle chamber's placement, neither at the entrance nor at the deepest level, but at a point where the surrounding chambers subtly reinforce its reverberations, suggests deliberate planning. Sound, in this space, was not incidental. It was invited. One of the most striking aspects of the oracle chamber is the way its resonance impacts groups. Experiments with multiple participants have shown that when a voice sings or chants within the chamber, the frequency resonates through the bodies of listeners. Their nervous systems synchronize to a degree that is rare in ordinary environments. Physical sensations intensify. Breathing slows. Some report a gentle dizziness, not unpleasant, but disarming, like standing on the threshold of sleep. Others feel as if the boundary between their own heartbeat and the echoing chamber dissolves. This effect is strongest among men, whose vocal range often dips closer to 110 Hz, but women experience it as well, through harmonic vibration rather than direct tone. It is difficult not to wonder whether the builders of the hypogeum understood this effect not intellectually but experientially. Perhaps they discovered it gradually, testing tones within the chamber until a particular vibration seemed to unlock something, emotionally, spiritually, or neurologically. But the precision of the chamber's architecture complicates this theory. The curvature of its walls, the depth of its alcoves, the smoothness of its surfaces all play a role in its acoustic behavior. These features seem too intentional, too collaborative, to be the product of trial alone, implying knowledge, not necessarily mathematical knowledge in the modern sense, but experiential knowledge accumulated across generations. If sound was used as a tool in the hypogeum, then the oracle chamber may have served as a place not of speaking, but of listening. A place where the living could enter a state perceptually distinct from their everyday world, perhaps to commune with ancestors, perhaps to interpret dreams, perhaps to access something the surface world obscured. The spirals painted in red oak are nearby, the honeycomb patterns, the niches shaped like windows into absent light. These may not be mere decoration, but symbolic anchors for those undergoing altered awareness. Spirals are among the oldest symbols associated with consciousness, transition, and inward movement. In combination with the chamber's resonance, they create an atmosphere that feels intentionally designed to lead someone inward, downward, into a state where the boundaries between worlds feel thinner. If the hypogeum was a place of ritual sound work, the implications reach beyond mythology. They suggest that its builders possessed an understanding not only of stone and structure, but of the human mind. Altered states, induced through vibration, could have served many purposes: healing, communication, initiation, or the creation of communal cohesion. In many ancient cultures, sound is not merely aesthetic, but functional. Tibetan monks used deep chants to regulate physiological processes. Indigenous groups employed drumming to shift consciousness. Even in ancient Greece, certain rites centered on frequencies believed to align the human soul with cosmic rhythms. Could the hypogeum represent an even older tradition, one preserved in stone rather than carried in oral memory. One cannot ignore either how the oracle chamber shapes the human voice. Sounds spoken within it lose their human quality. They thicken, slow, deepen. Some visitors describe hearing their own words stretched, as though they came from a larger version of themselves. Others feel that their voice becomes unrecognizable, overtaken by the chamber's resonance. If one imagines a ritual leader speaking within such an environment, the effect on participants would be overwhelming, creating an aura of authority, presence, or even supernatural magnitude. A voice amplified by the chamber could seem more than human, and if the skulls once found in the hypogeum truly differed in shape or size, the resonance they experienced or produced might have been even more pronounced. What complicates the mystery further is the fact that sound does not behave uniformly throughout the hypogeum. Some areas muffle it completely. Others carry whispers across distances that seem improbable. Archaeologists have demonstrated that a whisper in one chamber can be heard clearly in another, while a shout may dissolve entirely. This pattern suggests a deliberate mapping of acoustic zones, areas for silence, areas for resonance, areas for transmission. To what purpose? Theories abound. One proposes that the structure mirrors the inner ear, with chambers corresponding to cochlear passages. Another suggests that the hypogeum is a replica of surface temples turned inward, designed not for the gods, but for the psyche. Whatever its true purpose, the oracle chamber remains the hypogeum's beating heart, the point where architecture and awareness converge. And if its resonance was intentional, then the chamber becomes not simply a room, but a message, a frequency encoded into stone, waiting for those sensitive enough to feel it. Yet the question lingers. If this chamber was tuned so precisely, who was it tuned for? Were the rituals meant for the people whose bones were later found here, or for a group who preceded them, an earlier lineage with different voices, different bodies, different ways of perceiving reality? And if the oracle chamber was designed for beings who understood sound in ways we have forgotten, what echoes of their presence still hum beneath the limestone, waiting for someone to hear them again? There's a point in every mystery when the boundary between documentation and recollection begins to blur, and the story shifts from the realm of artifacts into the strange territory of testimony. After descending into the geometry of sound, after encountering a chamber whose resonance alters perception itself, the next movement in this quiet journey through Malta leads toward a figure who stepped into the hypogeum long after its builders vanished, but who, in her brief visit, left behind one of the most unsettling accounts ever recorded about the place. Her name was Lois Jessup, and although she was not an archaeologist or a scholar, the shadows she stirred have lingered for decades, as if the island once again slipped and allowed someone to glimpse something it had been trying to hide. Jessup arrived in Malta in the 1940s as secretary for the British Admiralty. Her curiosity about the island's megaliths was not unusual. Visitors have long been drawn toward the ancient. But her interest in the hypogeum was something deeper, a quiet pull, as though the underground structure called to those who sensed its unsettled past. When she toured the site, it was still accessible in ways no longer permitted today. Visitors could enter areas that have since been sealed for conservation, and guards relied on lanterns rather than electric lighting. The darkness was older then, less filtered, more honest. Her account, published later in an aviation magazine, does not begin dramatically. She described narrow stairs leading downward, a stillness that felt heavier than the air should allow, and chambers that seemed to stretch in ways she could not quite understand. The guide's lantern flickered along carved walls. Dust drifted. The past sat quietly, watching. But the moment that would give her story its lasting weight occurred in a lower chamber, one that the guide insisted was the final accessible space. Beyond it lay a small opening, a crevice in the stone that appeared to lead into another passage. Jessup, curious and slender enough to reach it, moved closer despite the guide's disapproval. He cautioned her that the passage led only to collapsed rubble, that there was nothing beyond it, but her account insists otherwise. She leaned toward the opening, held her lantern into the darkness, and let the light extend as far as the narrow space allowed. For a moment, she saw only dust and shadow. Then, the lantern's glow caught movement. Not a trick of the light, not the flickering of a flame, but figures, 3 or more, standing in the passage beyond. She described them as tall, far taller than any normal person she knew, with long limbs and silhouettes that seemed too slender for their height. They stood still, not approaching, not retreating. As the light touched them, they turned, not in a sudden movement, but in a slow, deliberate way, as though reacting to her presence. In that instant, Jessup felt something like a wave of breathless cold, a change in air pressure, a sensation of being observed more intently than she had ever been in her life. And then, as quickly as her courage had appeared, it faltered, and she drew back, nearly stumbling. The guide, irritated, insisted she step away from the crevice. He told her again that there was nothing beyond it. No passage, no chamber, certainly no figures. The moment passed, but her memory of it did not. She later wrote that the figures seemed aware, not spectral, solid, not imagined. She knew the human mind could play tricks in dim spaces, but she was certain she had not hallucinated. She insisted that the beings she saw were real, not lingering illusions of shadow and stone. The academic world dismissed her account almost immediately. Visitors, they argued, often project their own anxieties into dark chambers. Like distortion, depth, misjudgment, and the human tendency to humanize shapes could easily turn shadows into silhouettes. Others went further, calling it fantasy, gesturing toward the post-war context, suggesting that the island's atmosphere and Jessup's own imagination filled in what the lantern could not clarify. Yet her story persisted, not in the halls of academia, but in the quiet corners of conversation among those who sensed that the hypogeum's deepest layers still withheld truths. Several details of her testimony echoed earlier, lesser-known accounts. Workers in the early 1900s had whispered of tunnels extending beyond the charted chambers. Some claimed they led to areas so deep that lanterns extinguished themselves. Others reported hearing voices or footsteps where no one had entered. During the years when school children were said to have gone missing in the underground, the incident never fully documented but whispered for decades. The searchers claimed to hear faint cries from passages far below, yet the source was never found. Jessup likely never heard these stories. She was not a folklorist gathering tales, and yet her description aligned eerily with rumors scattered across half a century. One part of her account is especially strange. She described the reaction of the guide, not simply annoyance, but a kind of fear masked as irritation. He insisted too strongly that the passage contained nothing. He repeated it as though rehearsed, as though he'd been instructed to maintain a boundary between what was seen and what was permitted to be acknowledged. This detail is subtle, but it resonates with a broader pattern. The hypogeum's deepest areas have long been restricted, sealed, or quietly forgotten. Even official maps show inconsistencies over the decades, with certain spaces appearing in early diagrams and disappearing in later ones. It is not impossible that Jessup saw shadows mistaken for living forms. The human mind seeks patterns, especially in dim light. But our insistence on height, proportion, and movement carries an unsettling precision. She did not describe vague shapes, she described beings, distinct, tall, long-limbed, turned toward her in apparent acknowledgement. If she hallucinated, the detail is uncanny. If she saw other visitors, their height would have been absurd within the narrow, cramped conditions of the lower passages. And if she saw workers, none were known to be near that area at the time. There is also the question of why the opening she described was later sealed. Restoration teams closed portions of the hypogeum, not only for conservation, but because certain areas were deemed unstable. Yet even before these closures, some tunnels were no longer accessible to the public without clear explanation. If Jessup truly glimpsed a deeper level, perhaps she saw a portion of the hypogeum that is no longer acknowledged, a part of the structure that early excavators once mapped, but later removed from record for reasons now lost or quietly held. Skeptics argue that no hidden chambers exist, but even today, ground-penetrating surveys are limited in such delicate archaeological environments. The hypogeum structure is so complex, so layered, that even experts admit there may be cavities beneath or beyond what is currently mapped. Geological shifts could have closed passages once accessible, or passages might have been intentionally sealed in later periods by people who inherited the structure without understanding it fully. So the question that has haunted Jessup's account remains: if she truly saw figures, who or what did she see? Was it simply a trick of shifting darkness, the mind inventing forms where none existed? Was it a memory rising from stone, some echo of the hypogeum's ancient ritual? Or did she, for a brief moment, witness beings in a place that history insists should be empty? And if something stood there, turning toward her in silence, what else might still move in the chambers that have not been touched by light in thousands of years? There is something quietly disorienting about the way the hypogeum behaves in the historical record. It is not only the chambers that shift in the dark, nor the resonance that bends the human voice, nor the testimony of a woman who claimed to see tall figures waiting in a passage no longer acknowledged. It is the structure's own cartography, its tendency to appear differently depending on who maps it, when it is mapped, and what parts of the map are allowed to survive. The deeper the descent goes, the more it becomes clear that the hypogeum is not merely a place but a palimpsest, a series of overwritten layers, some erased with intention, others left visible only as faint impressions beneath the surface of official reports. After Louise Jessup published her account, those who had visited the hypogeum decades earlier began to recall their own experiences. Workers, guides, even a few early researchers. Their memories did not match perfectly, but certain threads repeated with unsettling consistency. A passage that seemed to extend farther than the guidebook said, a chamber that appeared on one visit and was sealed on the next, a staircase noted in an early diagram but omitted in later versions. These discrepancies could easily be dismissed as confusion, misinterpretation, or the natural evolution of archaeological documentation. But the frequency of the contradictions and the way they clustered specifically around the lower levels raised questions that no official narrative has comfortably answered. Early excavation notes, particularly those made before 1910, refer repeatedly to a lower series of corridors or a deeper complex not yet fully explored. Some descriptions even suggest that the hypogeum extended beyond the mapped chambers into a more elaborate system that dropped further into the limestone. A British officer who visited during the early phases of excavation wrote privately that the structure seemed to descend in terraces, like a subterranean amphitheater or a buried city. Another visitor, a Maltese doctor, claimed in a letter that one passage seemed to lead toward acoustic hollows, where lantern light failed to penetrate. None of these accounts made it into formal publications. Instead, they remain tucked away in archives, overshadowed by the polished narrative of a three-level structure, neatly bounded and thoroughly contained. The strange disappearance of certain mapped features is not unique to the hypogeum, but it is here that the discrepancies feel most deliberate. Early plans drawn by workmen show narrow corridors leading away from the main halls. Some of these corridors end in abrupt angles, as though the mapmaker was not permitted or not able to continue drawing. Others show faint outlines of additional chambers, left unlabeled, sometimes crossed out in pencil or ink. In one surviving diagram, rarely reproduced publicly, a long passage extends beneath what is now a residential area, marked only with a note, "Unexplored." Later maps show no trace of it. The shifting nature of these records could be explained by changes in archaeological approach. In the early 20th century, excavators often interpreted natural fissures as man-made tunnels, or vice versa. They sometimes mapped areas based on incomplete visibility or partial collapses, but these explanations do not fully account for why certain passages were sealed quickly, why some chambers were never investigated beyond a cursory glance, or why the hypogeum's depth became a subject so sensitive that access was severely restricted by the mid-century. One theory suggests that instability in the limestone made further exploration dangerous. Malta's geology is riddled with cavities. Entire neighborhoods have suffered from sinkholes as the bedrock collapses inward. The underground structure may have posed structural risks, and sealing areas could have been a protective measure. But the timing is curious. Some sections were sealed not decades after discovery, but almost immediately, and without clear explanation. Even local workers reportedly questioned why certain areas were filled, blocked, or walled off when they appeared stable and intact. Another explanation points to conservation. The hypogeum suffered from humidity issues early on, leading to deterioration of its red ochre paintings. Restricting access was necessary to preserve what remained. Yet the sealed passages do not correspond neatly to the areas with fragile art. In fact, some of the blocked tunnels were devoid of decoration entirely. They were, according to early notes, bare limestone, functional, not ornamental. Why seal what offered no threat to artwork? Why close areas that did not seem structurally compromised? Why remove them from maps altogether? When researchers in the 1960s attempted to reconcile early excavation plans with contemporary surveys, they noted inconsistencies that could not be squared with simple errors. It was as though the hypogeum had been selectively edited, with entire features erased from collective memory. A few of these researchers suggested privately that political or administrative decisions might have influenced what remained open. Malta's colonial administration had reasons to control narratives surrounding unusual discoveries. Tourism, stability, and academic reputation all mattered. A site that stirred rumors of giants, strange bones, missing children, or unexplained passages was a liability. Keeping the narrative simple, isolated, contained, comprehensible, served a broader institutional purpose. There is, too, the possibility that some of the passages were intentionally sealed by the ancient builders themselves, long before modern archaeologists arrived. The hypogeum's chambers show evidence of multiple phases of use. Some walls bear tool marks consistent with the earliest construction phases. Others display smoothing or refilling associated with later generations who may have repurposed the site. A sealed passage, therefore, may not indicate modern intervention, but ancient closure. If so, the reason for the closure becomes a new mystery. Were certain areas considered sacred, forbidden, or dangerous? Did they lead to chambers that held rituals no longer permitted, or memories too heavy to carry forward? Rumors from the 20th century, whispered by locals living near the site, tell of tunnels connecting the hypogeum to other underground structures across Malta. Some claim these passages ran all the way to the fortifications of Valletta. Others say they connected to ritual chambers beneath the Toxian temples. While no verified map confirms such an extensive network, Malta's geology makes the idea less improbable than it sounds. The island's underground is honeycombed with natural caves, many of which were expanded artificially over millennia. It is not impossible that the hypogeum once linked to a broader, now-lost subterranean world. What lends weight to these rumors is not the stories themselves, but the reactions to them. Officials consistently dismiss any suggestion of deeper networks. Archaeologists insist the site ends where the map ends. Yet for all their certainty, none can fully explain the contradictions in earlier records, the missing diagrams, the sealed stonework, or the witnesses who describe deeper levels that no longer appear in any official documentation. If Lois Jessup indeed saw figures standing in a passage, and if that passage once extended beyond what is now mapped, then her experience exists at the intersection of testimony and deletion, between what was once visible and what is now denied. And in that narrow space where light flickers and memory holds its breath, The hypogeum reveals its most troubling characteristic. Its shape is not fixed. It shifts depending on who enters, who records, and who decides what must remain in darkness. So the question lingers like a breath caught in the stone. If certain passages were truly sealed, whether by ancient hands or modern ones, what lies beyond them, waiting in the quiet, untouched, unseen? There are stories that survive not because they are written, but because they refuse to disappear. They linger at the edges of communal memory, whispered by those who claim to remember something they were never supposed to hear, and by those who insist that silence itself is proof of omission. After exploring the vanishing maps of the hypogeum and the inconsistencies surrounding its passages, the descent now reaches one of the most troubling threads in Malta's underground lore: the tale of the missing schoolchildren. A story dismissed by officials, softened by time, and yet repeated with such consistency among locals that ignoring it becomes harder than acknowledging it. The version most often told begins in the 1930s, when a group of schoolchildren from a nearby convent school were taken on an educational tour of the hypogeum. It was a time before modern restrictions, when visitors entered the site more freely and guides allowed exploration with far fewer boundaries. The children were said to have wandered into an area considered safe, the lowest publicly accessible level, while their teachers and the guide remained near the entrance chamber. Everything seemed ordinary until the moment someone counted the group and realized that several children were missing. Not one, not two, but a cluster, their exact number varying depending on who recounts the story. When the guide and teachers rushed back through the chambers calling their names, no voices responded. The children had vanished as quietly as if the stone itself had absorbed them. The search that followed was frantic. Lanterns were brought in. Workers crawled into narrow spaces. Some reports claim that searchers heard faint cries echoing from below, as though the children were trapped in deeper layers. But every time they followed the sound, it seemed to retreat farther, slipping through the limestone like something alive. Finally, the searchers reached a point where the passages grew too narrow, too unstable, or simply ended in darkness. At that point, the story fractures. In one version, the children were never found. Their disappearance was covered up, attributed to wartime confusion or administrative error. In another version, the children were eventually recovered, shaken but alive, though officials instructed the school not to speak publicly about what had happened. A third version claims that no such event occurred at all, and that the tale emerged out of exaggerated fear and imaginative storytelling surrounding a site already thick with mystery. The lack of documentation fuels the ambiguity. No newspaper article survived from the period that reference missing children in the hypogeum. No police reports have been produced. No archival evidence has been brought forward in support of the narrative. And yet, the story persists. Locals speak of hearing it from grandparents, teachers, or neighbors who claim to know someone involved. Former employees of the site recall hearing rumors during their training. Even guides who reject the story acknowledge that it is one of the most frequently asked questions by visitors, suggesting that the myth has circulated far beyond its original source. Skeptics argue that the story spread because the hypogeum is an ideal setting for fear. Its shadows invite invention. Its passages resemble the labyrinths of folklore. And the idea of children vanishing underground taps into a universal anxiety that travels easily from generation to generation. But skeptics rarely address another possibility: that the absence of evidence may stem not from fabrication, but from the era in which the alleged event occurred. In the 1930s, Malta was under British colonial administration. The island's political atmosphere was tense. Order and stability were paramount. A scandal involving missing children in a prehistoric site, especially one already associated with strange discoveries, would have been inconvenient. Suppressing information would have been simple. Or perhaps the disappearance was real, but less dramatic than the myth suggests. Perhaps a few children wandered temporarily into a side passage and were found quickly. A minor scare could, over time, evolve into a legend. Collective memory is rarely literal. It is shaped by emotion, not accuracy. But there are details in the oral accounts that resist such simplification. Many versions mention voices, distant, displaced, echoing from below. The same motif recurs in earlier records from workers who heard sounds in passages that no longer appear on modern maps. Even Jessop's account included the sensation of movement or presence beyond the visible light. It is as though the hypogerm has always encouraged the belief that something lies concealed in its deeper layers, whether physical or psychological. Then there is the matter of the sealed passageways. Several areas of the hypogerm are blocked in the early 20th century. Conservation was one reason, but the timing of some closures coincides uncannily with the period when the children's story is said to have taken place. One cannot claim these closures were related, but the parallel rests uneasily in the imagination. It is difficult not to wonder whether the sealing of certain areas was prompted by the discovery of something unexpected, something officials preferred not to discuss. There is also the complication of Malta's larger network of caves and tunnels. The island is riddled with natural cavities and ancient catacombs. Some experts believe that prehistoric people may have expanded existing caves into larger complexes. If a side passage of the hypogeum once connected to a natural fissure or collapsed cavity, it is not impossible that a group of children could have wandered into an area too dangerous or unstable for rescuers to pursue. If so, sealing the entrance may have been deemed necessary, but sealing usually comes with documentation. Here, the record is strangely blank. Psychologists sometimes suggest that stories of missing children arise in cultures where memory of past trauma persists. Malta endured invasions, sieges, and hardships that left deep imprints on its cultural psyche. The hypogeum, with its thousands of skeletons, may unconsciously evoke those older losses. The children's tale may be the modern mind's attempt to articulate an unease that stretches across centuries. Another interpretation, whispered rarely and without certainty, suggests that the story persists because it resonates with something the hypogeum itself embodies: the sense of layering, of disappearance, of descent into spaces where history refuses to follow. The site holds the remains of thousands, yet tells almost nothing of their daily lives. It contains chambers carved with impossible precision, yet reveals nothing of the minds behind them. Why wouldn't people project narratives of loss onto a place that is itself a monument to forgotten lives? And yet, for all these rational interpretations, a final set of questions remains. If the missing children's story were purely imaginary, why is it so geographically specific? Why does it refer to exact chambers, exact passages, exact conditions that align with early excavation diagrams rather than modern ones? Why do older versions of the story mention features that existed before conservation changes, details the average storyteller would not know? Why do so many accounts reference a sound, a distant echo, a cry for help, that drifts from below, as though the hypogeum is shaped to carry voices from places no longer accessible? Whether the tale records an actual event or a communal dream, it has settled into the hypogeum's mythology as firmly as any artifact. It remains one of the island's most enduring whispers, a reminder that the underground world holds its stories differently than the surface does. And if the hypogeum truly once opened into deeper levels where voices could be heard but not reached, what else might have moved in those lower darknesses, unseen by those above, yet listening still? There comes a point in any long descent through forgotten history when the stones themselves seem less mysterious than the silence surrounding them. The missing bones, the sealed passages, the vanished maps, the echoes of the children's story, each of these threads tugs at the edges of something larger, something less tangible than physical evidence. And here, as the journey reaches the threshold between the subterranean world and the institutions meant to interpret it, the focus shifts from chambers carved in the Neolithic to the quieter architecture of the 20th century, the structure of academic authority, the standardization of archaeological narratives, and the slow, deliberate smoothing of the hypogeum's rough edges into a story the modern world could accept. The early decades of Maltese archaeology were chaotic. Excavations were rushed, documentation inconsistent, and the competing interests of colonial administration, museum directors, local authorities, and international scholars shaped the way discoveries were recorded or not recorded. The hypogeum, with its scale and strangeness, arrived at a moment when archaeology was attempting to present itself as a disciplined science, rather than a patchwork of curiosity-driven explorations. Anything that threatened that image, anything ambiguous, anomalous, or disruptive, was treated with caution, if not quietly pushed aside. As the fields of anthropology and archaeology matured, early reports of elongated skulls, unusual proportions, or inexplicable engineering began to feel inconvenient. They belonged to an era perceived as less rigorous, less reliable, too open to speculation. And so, when institutions sought to formalize Malta's prehistory, these irregularities were quietly omitted, not necessarily with sinister intent, but with the confidence that their removal created coherence. A clean story was a stronger story. A tidy narrative was a professional narrative. This process, though subtle, is visible when comparing early notes with later publications. Magri's private descriptions, filled with hesitations and observations that defy easy interpretation, contrast sharply with the polished summaries produced after his death. His mention of unusual skulls becomes a line about varied remains. His references to deeper corridors become areas not structurally viable for exploration. His uncertainty becomes absence, and absence becomes the foundation for a new, official version of the past. By the mid-20th century, the hypogeum's image had transformed. It was no longer a labyrinth of strange acoustics and puzzling remains, but a neatly framed funerary complex, an impressive but understandable expression of early ritual behavior. Museum displays emphasized the beauty of its architecture, the symmetry of its chambers, the artistry of the red ochre designs. Guides were trained to speak of ceremonial practices, communal burials, and symbolic worldviews. This version of the site is not incorrect, but it is incomplete. It ignores the ambiguity. It resists the discomfort. It hides the questions that refuse to align with the linear, evolution-based model of human development. The erasure of anomalies was not unique to Malta. Archaeology worldwide underwent a period often referred to quietly as the cleanup. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers, travelogues, and excavation diaries were filled with accounts that do not fit neatly into today's archaeological frameworks. Reports of unusually tall skeletons in North America, peculiar skulls in Peru, inexplicable structures in the Mediterranean. These stories complicated emerging theories about human origins, migration, and development. The new academic institutions, seeking credibility, began stripping away what they considered unreliable. But in the process, something valuable was lost. Not proof of giants or lost civilizations, but the humility that comes with acknowledging the incomplete nature of our understanding. By smoothing the record, the discipline insulated itself from mystery. And in Malta, perhaps more than any other place, that insulation created a distance between the official narrative and the whispers that never faded. Even today, scholars rarely reference early discrepancies unless pressed. They argue, reasonably, that early observers lacked training, that misidentifications were common, that sensationalism distorted reports. All true. But even these cautions do not explain why so many items disappeared altogether. Photographs no longer found in archives, bones said to be misplaced, maps that contradict one another, and testimonies quietly dismissed without investigation. Some researchers suggest that the erasure was not active suppression, but rather passive neglect. An unwillingness to pursue leads that did not align with accepted models. Funding priorities favored explanation, not contradiction. Careers grew from coherent narratives, not from reopening questions that colleagues had considered settled. Over time, the hypogeum's strangeness was domesticated, transformed into something manageable. By the time UNESCO recognized the site, the official script was fully in place. The hypogeum was a unique but comprehensible Neolithic mortuary site. Its acoustics were a curiosity but not a mystery. Its bones were typical, its rituals symbolic, its builders familiar. The early accounts that suggested otherwise were categorized as folklore or misinterpretation. The questions that lingered were relegated to footnotes, if acknowledged at all. And yet in the quiet spaces between the official lines, the older threads still wait. A curator in the 1970s reportedly told a visiting researcher that certain artifacts from early excavations had been locked away because their context was uncertain. A later director allegedly remarked that some finds create more controversy than clarity. These comments may reflect prudence rather than secrecy, but they reveal an underlying tension. Not everything discovered fits neatly into the adopted narrative. The shift in archaeological attitude toward Malta also mirrors a broader change in how the discipline treats the unknown. Early archaeologists were often too willing to speculate to fill gaps with imagination. Modern archaeologists, by contrast, often err in the opposite direction, discarding anything that does not support established frameworks. Somewhere between these extremes lies a space where truth might breathe more freely, where anomalies might be held without immediate dismissal, where silence might be interpreted not as absence but as invitation. And this tension raises a quieter, more unsettling possibility. If the hypogeum was edited, whether intentionally or through the gradual narrowing of academic vision, what motivations guided that editing? Was it a desire for professional clarity, a need for political stability, a fear of sensationalism, or something deeper? Did the institutions responsible for shaping its narrative simply wish to protect the site's dignity? Or did they wish to protect the public from the discomfort of an untidy past? Perhaps the cleanup was benign. Perhaps it was pragmatic. Perhaps it was unconscious. But the result is the same, a version of the hypogeum that sits comfortably within linear human history, while the shadows of earlier accounts hover, unacknowledged, at its edges. And as the story continues downward, toward the interconnected world of Mediterranean megaliths, toward parallels that stretch across seas, one is left to wonder, if history was tidied so carefully here, what truths might lie tangled in the threads that were swept aside? There is a strange comfort in believing that a mystery belongs to one place alone. It allows the mind to confine the unknown, to quarantine it within boundaries both physical and psychological. But the deeper the story of Malta's underground becomes, its missing bones, its vanishing maps, the soft erasure of anomalies, the harder it is to hold on to the idea that the island stands isolated in its strangeness. Instead, a quieter truth begins to form, not through certainty but through resonance. Malta is not alone. Its stones, its silences, its architectural impossibilities echo across the Mediterranean like fragments of a forgotten sentence spoken by civilizations separated by sea but united by something older than memory. To trace this resonance, one must leave the darkness of the hypogeum and step, if only in thought, across the waters to Sardinia. There, the Nuragic culture built towers of stacked stone, nuraghi, rising like fossilized watchtowers of a vanished order. Scattered among them lie elongated tombs known locally as Tom dei Giganti, the giants' tombs, named long before archaeology formalized their classification. Early travelers described these structures with phrases that matched the tone once used in Malta: monumental, inhuman in scale, oddly proportional to beings larger than the island's later inhabitants. While modern scholars attribute the name to myth rather than morphology, the similarity between Sardinia's legends and Malta's is difficult to ignore. Both islands hold tales of builders too tall, too strong, too ancient to belong to the known timeline. Even stranger is the fact that the Nuragic people, despite their monumental architecture, left behind no written language. Their stone towers, some more complex than medieval fortresses, emerged suddenly and fully formed around the same period Malta's temple culture disappeared. The two islands were not isolated. Maritime routes between Malta, Sicily, and Sardinia are well established in early prehistory. Contacts, however sparse, were possible. Yet instead of gradual diffusion of ideas, the archaeological record shows abrupt appearances, cultures rising into architectural brilliance seemingly without precursors, as though they inherited knowledge rather than developed it. Moving eastward, the pattern continues. On Crete, long before the Minoans carved palaces into the landscape, myths spoke of beings who shaped the island, the Kurates, dactyls, and telchines, described in some texts as giant craftsmen, capable of metalworking, stone shaping, and ritual dance that bridged the human and the divine. Their presence in myth parallels the Maltese Sansuna, solitary, powerful, shaping the land before humans established their settlements. Again, mythology is not evidence, but it is curious how often myths of ancient builders cluster around regions with megalithic remains whose origins remain partly opaque. Farther still, in the Levant and Anatolia, one finds accounts of the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Nephilim, ancient peoples described not metaphorically but physically as tall, mighty, or of old. These accounts, preserved in Hebrew, Ugaritic, and early Greek texts, often appear alongside descriptions of fortified cities whose stones seemed beyond the capacity of later cultures. Scholars interpret these references symbolically or as exaggerations, yet the consistency of the descriptions and their geographic overlap with mysterious stonework create a familiar shiver, the sense that these stories echo something too persistent to dismiss entirely. Even in Anatolia, at the site of Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists uncovered T-shaped megaliths carved with precision thousands of years before agriculture took root in the region. The sophistication of the reliefs, the planning of the circular enclosures, and the astronomical references embedded in the site have led researchers to question long-held assumptions about the linear progression of human capacity. How could hunter-gatherers supposedly living in small nomadic bands have organized the labor and skill required for such an undertaking? And why does this site, like Malta's temples, appear almost without precedent, its complexity arriving suddenly rather than emerging gradually? Across the Mediterranean, from the Balearic Islands to Cyprus, similar patterns emerge. Megalithic structures appearing abruptly, myths of ancient beings intertwined with local identity, and archaeological puzzles that resist fitting neatly into evolutionary models. Malta, then, becomes not an anomaly, but a node, a point in a larger network of ancient memory. And it is in this network that Malta's mystery becomes heavier, not lighter. For if Malta's temple culture emerged suddenly and vanished without clear descendants, so too did other Mediterranean megalithic traditions. Their languages are lost, their rituals remain shadows. Their architectural principles appear mature at their inception and disappear without extension. This pattern defies the typical arc of civilization, which rises, evolves, diffuses, and leaves behind discernible influence. Instead, these cultures resemble flashes, brief illuminations in deep time, bright enough to carve stone but fleeting enough to leave behind only the stretches themselves, stripped of context. Some anthropologists propose that these parallels are coincidental, products of convergent cultural evolution. The human brain, they argue, is predisposed towards certain symbolic structures, circles, spirals, large stones arranged in alignment with celestial events. But such explanations struggle when placed against the specificity of Malta's hippodrome, Sardinia's Nuraghe towers, Crete's mythic lineages, and Anatolia's pre-agricultural megaliths. These sites do not merely reflect shared symbolism, they reflect shared enigmas, abrupt beginnings, missing developmental phases, and mythologies that echo each other across the sea. Maritime archaeology provides another clue. There is increasing evidence that early seafaring in the Mediterranean began far earlier than once believed. Ancient DNA analysis from islands like Sicily and Cyprus reveals multiple waves of migration long before the Bronze Age, suggesting a network of maritime routes that facilitated cultural exchange. If so, the builders of Malta's temples may have been part of a larger movement, one not fully preserved in material culture, but visible in the architectural fingerprints scattered across the region. Yet even this hypothesis struggles under the weight of certain details. A culture capable of constructing the apogum, with its tuned acoustics, its labyrinthine chambers, its red ochre symbols placed with ritual precision, would not simply dissolve without leaving behind a trace of its intellectual legacy. And yet, that legacy is curiously absent. Later Maltese cultures do not display the same architectural ambition. They do not replicate the acoustics. They do not maintain the underground tradition. It is as if whatever knowledge allowed the builders to carve stone in resonant geometry evaporated suddenly, leaving behind echoes carved in limestone but no successors to interpret them. At this stage, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Across the Mediterranean, monumental structures appear as if from nowhere, accompanied by myths of beings stronger, taller, or wiser than later inhabitants. The archaeological record shows brilliance without a clear lineage, disappearance without transition, and knowledge without visible origin. Malta's temples and hippodrome are part of this larger chorus, a chorus of ancient architecture speaking in tones we no longer fully understand. And so the question grows quieter and heavier, settling into the space between islands and centuries. If these megalithic cultures were connected, not by myth alone, but by shared knowledge or shared ancestry, what common source shaped their sudden rise, and why did it vanish so completely that only stones remain to remember it? There is a certain stillness found only in places beneath the earth, a stillness that feels less like absence and more like concentration, as if the walls themselves are listening. After following Malta's mysteries across the Mediterranean's megalithic constellation, the story now turns inward again, towards something less architectural and more psychological. The idea that underground spaces, across cultures and continents, may serve not simply as shelters or ritual chambers, but as repositories of cultural memory. And if Malta's hippodrome feels as though it remembers more than it reveals, perhaps it is because underground structures often hold the last traces of worlds that surface history has forgotten. Across Anatolia lies Derinkuyu, an underground city reaching many stories into the earth, capable of sheltering tens of thousands. Its chambers form a vast concealed universe, ventilation shafts, stone doors that roll into place, stables, wine rooms, schools. Although many date it to the first millennium BCE, deeper layers suggest older origins, their purpose obscured by later reuse. No one knows exactly who first carved them, or why the instinct to go underground was so powerful that entire populations disappeared below for months at a time. Some scholars propose invasion as the motive, others suggest climate extremes, others still consider ritual isolation. Yet Derinkuyu's scale feels too grand, too deliberate for temporary refuge. It feels like a memory of something more prolonged, more existential. Cappadocia's other subterrestrial complexes, Kaymakli, Uzkonek, Masi, echo this same refusal to explain themselves. They seem to belong to a long-hidden tradition of subterranean habitation, one that spans regions and time periods without revealing its point of origin. The deeper one goes into these structures, the more familiar the sensation becomes. The architecture narrows into passages that guide, structures that cradle, chambers that resonate. The spaces are not simply functional, they're intimate, almost womb-like, designed not only to protect bodies, but to preserve stories. Malta's hypogeum shares this quality. It is not a defensive structure. It does not show signs of hasty excavation or makeshift engineering. Its geometry is too refined, its acoustics too intentional. Whatever drove its builders beneath the earth was not fear in the simple sense. It may have been reverence, or tradition, or necessity born of a trauma now lost beneath the layers of time. The idea that subterranean spaces hold society's deepest memories appears across the ancient world. In Crete, the Idaean cave, birthplace of Zeus according to myth, served as a refuge of divine infancy. In Israel, the Bel Caves form a labyrinth of light and stone, echoing with histories erased by later conquest. In Egypt, the Serapeum at Saqqara hides beneath the desert, massive granite sarcophagi placed in corridors with unnerving precision. In India, the Ajanta and Ellora caves preserve thousands of years of spiritual practice, carved into a single mountainside, as if time was stored in layers of stone rather than scrolls. In each case, the underground world holds something foundational, either the earliest memories of a people or the final remnants of a civilization that had nowhere else to place its lost truths. Could Malta's hypogeum belong to this lineage of subterranean memory? A place built not only for ritual but for preservation, of identity, of fear, of knowledge. The Mediterranean and the world has undergone catastrophic climate shift in the past. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose more than 100 meters. Vast coastlines vanished. Islands were reshaped. Entire land bridges disappeared. Malta itself was once part of a larger landmass connected to Sicily, a terrain walked by animals and humans long before the Holocene sea surge severed it into fragments. As the waters rose, any coastal or low-lying settlements would have vanished, leaving only high-ground structures and whatever was buried safely beneath the stone. Archaeologists now acknowledge that many prehistoric populations experienced dramatic bottlenecks, periods when their numbers dwindled to small groups. These groups carried fragments of older cultures but not the full weight of their ancestors' knowledge. In such circumstances, stories became compressed into symbols, spirals, giants, floods, descent, and ascent. What could not be fully remembered became myth, and what could not be spoken became ritual. If the original builders of Malta's underground world faced a catastrophe, climatic, geological, or cultural, the hypogeum might be a monument to survival rather than death, a place of retreat, transformation, or initiation in the wake of loss. The thousands of bones found there may represent not a purely funerary cult, but generations who passed through its chambers, leaving behind their remains as echoes of lives lived partly in darkness. Perhaps the underground was not feared. Perhaps it was home. Modern interpretations emphasize ritual, but ritual often forms around older scars. Spirals painted in ochre may reflect the oscillation of memory, what is kept, what is lost. The acoustic chamber may have facilitated altered states used to revisit or reinterpret catastrophic pasts. The architecture may mirror the psychic descent required to confront collective trauma. This pattern is not unique to Malta. In many cultures, the underworld is not simply a realm of the dead. It is a place of origins. In Greek thought, humanity emerges from the cavernous womb of Gaia. In Mesopotamian myth, knowledge is hidden in the Abzu beneath the world. In indigenous Australian cosmology, ancestral beings move through subterranean tunnels shaping the landscape. In Siberian shamanism, initiation often involves a symbolic journey into the earth, where the initiate's body is dismantled and reassembled with new understanding. These parallels are not evidence of a shared ancient civilization, but they reveal something older than specific cultures, the instinct to encode traumatic or transformative history in the dark, where human senses sharpen and memory becomes layered. If Malta's hypogeum is part of this instinct, then the mysteries surrounding its entrances, its sealed passages, and its architectural purpose may be reflections of a cultural memory too old to express itself directly. The builders may have inherited stories from ancestors who lived through environmental shifts, forced migrations, or societal collapse, stories now dissolved into mythic imagery. Even the legend of Sansuni, the solitary giantess shaping stones with impossible strength, may be a symbolic condensation of a long process, a culture remembering its founders as larger than life, literally and metaphorically. The figure of the giant appears in times of rupture, when societies look backward toward an age perceived as greater, stronger, wiser. In Malta's case, the rupture may have been profound enough that the surviving population carried only fragments, not the full knowledge of their ancestors, but the emotional contour of what happened. And when emotional memory survives but factual memory does not, it often chooses the underground as its refuge. This raises a quiet yet haunting possibility. If underground structures across the Mediterranean and beyond preserve the memory of ancient catastrophes, whether environmental, cultural, or spiritual, does the hypogeum represent Malta's chapter in that forgotten book? And if the earth itself holds the memory of older worlds in its hollow places, waiting beneath layers of stone and silence, while other truths lie hidden in subterranean darkness, untouched and unread, there is a kind of heaviness that settles when one begins to contemplate deep time, not the centuries that shape dynasties or the millennia that define civilizations, but the vast, indifferent ages in which the earth rearranges itself without concern for those who live upon it. After walking through Malta's underground world of memory, the narrative now rises into a silence of a different kind. The silence left behind by catastrophe. For if there is a thread running through Malta's contradictions, its sudden architectural brilliance, its missing origins, its descent underground, its echoes of cultures that seem to appear and vanish without continuity, it may be the shadow of an event far older and more powerful than the island itself. The end of the Last Ice Age, roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, was marked by abrupt and violent changes in the global climate. This period, the Younger Dryas, brought temperatures crashing downward, then surging upward again in a geological heartbeat. What had been slow thawing turned into calamity. Sea levels rose over 100 meters within a few millennia, swallowing coastlines, floodplains, and entire land bridges. Rivers redrew their courses, weather patterns collapsed and reformed. Human populations, few and fragile, were forced to relocate, adapt, or disappear. In this context, Malta was not the small island we know today. It was part of a larger landmass connected to Sicily, a region of rolling hills, fertile areas, and coastal plains now buried beneath the Mediterranean. The people who lived there would have experienced not a single event, but a slow series of losses. Shorelines creeping inward year by year, familiar paths vanishing, villages relocating continuously as the sea, ancient, steady, implacable, kept rising. Some geological studies suggest that parts of the Mediterranean experience localized surges, where meltwater pulses from the Atlantic and Black Sea push shorelines inward at terrifying speed. If a culture existed in this earlier landscape, one capable of building, observing, transmitting knowledge, its coastal centers may have been erased long before written memory. Floods do not preserve, they scour. They erase context, meaning, and genealogy. They leave behind only fragments too resistant to decay, stone, bone, and myth. It is in this light that Malta's abrupt architectural emergence becomes more troubling. The temples appear fully formed around 3600 BCE, thousands of years after the cataclysm that reshaped the Mediterranean. They carry complexity without developmental lineage, suggesting not spontaneous invention, but remembrance, or the reconstitution of something older, incompletely preserved through trauma. Their alignments hint at skywatching traditions. Their spirals echo the ancient symbol of cyclic destruction and renewal, and their subterranean chambers recall worlds submerged and lost. If Malta's prehistoric inhabitants descended into the earth, perhaps they did so not out of ritual alone, but out of ancestral memory, the memory of an age when the land itself gave way beneath their feet. Subterranean architecture might reflect not simply belief, but necessity. After all, people who survive catastrophe often build differently. They anchor their lives in stone. They carve inward rather than upward. They create environments that can withstand the unpredictability of a world that has betrayed them once already. The disappearance of Malta's temple culture around 2500 BCE becomes equally perplexing when viewed through this lens. Archaeological records show signs of stress, deforestation, soil degradation, population decline. But the sharpness of the decline, the near total absence of direct cultural continuity, suggests something more than gradual ecological strain. It suggests a fracture, a memory breaking, a society losing not only stability but identity. In anthropology, there is a phenomenon known as cultural amnesia. When a society, overwhelmed by trauma or population shift, loses the thread of its own narrative, traditions that were once foundational become fragmented, encoded into simplified rituals, or abandoned altogether. Architectural continuity collapses. Knowledge that once defined a people becomes inaccessible, not by suppression but by attrition. Malta's archaeological record shows just such a break. There is no slow transition from temple building to simpler structures. The practice simply stops. The later Bronze Age inhabitants show no sign of having inherited the knowledge of their predecessors. Even burial practices shift abruptly, as though a culture with millennia of tradition simply dissolved, leaving behind only the stone skeletons of its former brilliance. Could this be the long tail of a memory stretching back to the Younger Dryas? A memory held tenuously for thousands of years, then finally snapping under ecological or social strain. The idea is unsettling, yet strangely resonant. Cultures carry trauma for far longer than individuals. Flood myths appear in dozens of ancient traditions: Mesopotamian, Greek, Egyptian, Levantine, South Asian. They describe not metaphorical rainfalls but walls of water, land swallowed, ancestors fleeing to mountains or caves. These myths often center on renewal, the world remade after destruction. But beneath the narrative of rebirth lies the shadow of something lost, something that could not be rebuilt. It is tempting to dismiss Malta's temple collapse as a local phenomenon, but the same timing aligns with broader regional disruptions. Around 2200–2000 BCE, climate anomalies shook the Near East, Eastern Mediterranean, and Europe. Cultures declined or transformed, settlements were abandoned, trade networks vanished. The Akkadian Empire collapsed. Old Kingdom Egypt faced fragmentation. Mesopotamian texts mentioned famine and dust storms. The world shifted again, less dramatically than in the Younger Dryas, but enough to strain societies already carrying the weight of older memories. If Malta's temple culture was the remnant of a much older tradition, a tradition inherited from a population that survived rising seas, then the later climate crisis may have been the final fracture that severed their last link to their ancestral identity. A people who remembered the past through stone might have watched their last reservoirs of knowledge dry up with failing agriculture and dwindling population. In this interpretation, the hypogeum becomes not simply a mortuary ritual site, but a repository of memory, an underground echo of a landscape lost to the sea. Its chambers, spirals, and acoustics become symbolic expressions of descent and return, of remembering and forgetting. Some scholars note that the hippodrome's spiral motifs match those found in Neolithic art across Europe, often associated with cycles of life, death, and cosmic renewal. But perhaps they also represent the emotional spiral of a culture caught between two worlds, one drowned, one fragile. Even Sunsuna, the giantess whose myth lingered into Part 3, takes on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of cataclysm. Giants in myth are often remnants of earlier ages, beings who survived when ordinary humans did not, symbolic carriers of a world before the flood. Her solitary presence, her immense strength, her disappearance, all echo the archetype of a culture bearing more than it could hold. Yet for all these connections, for all these echoes between geology and myth, between collapse and memory, the question remains unanswered. How much of Malta's strangeness is the residue of catastrophe, and how much is the residue of something else entirely, something older and more elusive than climate, something that shaped the island long before its temples rose? Because if the earth has erased entire landscapes and swallowed countless histories, what prevents it from hiding something still deeper beneath Malta's limestone, waiting for the right silence to speak again? There is a moment when, following Malta's mystery from the depths of its limestone womb into the shifting horizon of its past, when the focus begins to move away from stones and skeletons and tunnels, and instead settles quietly upon the hands that shape the narrative around them. Evidence can vanish by accident, by erosion, by time, but meaning vanishes through something more deliberate, the slow, almost imperceptible pressure of institutions deciding what is worthy of preservation and what is not. As the journey nears its end, the path bends toward a different kind of subterranean realm, one not carved into rock, but built into the architecture of knowledge itself. History, for all its weight and confidence, is not a neutral ledger. It is a curated document, shaped by the priorities of those who record it. Malta, with its temples older than pyramids and its hypogeum whispering contradictions, entered European scholarship at a time when empires sought order, not ambiguity. When Malta came under British rule, its ancient past became part of a broader imperial project, cataloging, classifying, and defining the ancient world through a lens that favored continuity, predictability, and the unbroken progression of civilization from primitive simplicity to modern rationality. A place like the Hypogeum, dense with unexplainable architecture and anomalous remains, was not an archaeological marvel to be celebrated, but a problem to be corrected. The British Empire, like many imperial powers, believed itself to be the inheritor of humanity's rational destiny. Anything that suggested lost knowledge, forgotten civilizations, or unexplained intelligence threatened that narrative. If a Neolithic island population possessed engineering skills that rivaled or surpassed what the empire believed appropriate for the time, the implications were uncomfortable. It would mean that progress was not linear, that intelligence was not exclusive to the modern age, that the foundations of empire were built upon incomplete assumptions. And so, the story of Malta was subtly reshaped to align with expectations. This reshaping did not require conspiracy, it required preference. Reports that fit the desired timeline were published, translated, circulated. Reports that did not, those mentioning unusual bones, deeper chambers, or inexplicable craftsmanship, were left in archives, dismissed as errors of untrained observers, or edited into something more conventional. The absence of malice does not make the outcome any less significant. Silence, when repeated over decades, becomes indistinguishable from intent. Religion, too, played its part, not through dogma, but through influence. Malta, with its ancient sites and its early Christian history, sat at a crossroads where prehistory and theology intersected. Christian institutions had long been cautious about narratives that implied forgotten ages of advanced humans or vanished races. Such ideas complicated established cosmologies. They made the ancient world too large, too old, too independent. While the Church did not dictate archaeological policy, its cultural influence shaped which stories felt acceptable. The giantess Sunsuna, elongated skulls and labyrinthine underworlds did not fit comfortably into a world framed by biblical chronology. Therefore, they remained folklore rather than evidence. Even after Malta's independence, academic pressures continued the process of standardization. Universities and archaeological bodies rely on funding, peer review, and methodological consistency. Anything unusual, anything requiring new frameworks, risks professional scrutiny. And so, archaeologists avoid claims that fall outside the expected pattern. Bones that do not match the Mediterranean average must be pathological, not ancestral. Chambers with unexplainable sound behavior must be coincidental, not engineered. Stories of missing passages must be mistakes, not possibilities. The unknown is trimmed until it fits the container built for it. This is not fraud, it is survival. Institutions that manage knowledge do so by managing uncertainty. The more uncertain the past becomes, the less control the present seems to possess. And so, certainty is constructed, not through evidence, but through omission. Malta's ancient world becomes orderly, not because it was, but because order is easier to maintain than wonder. But beneath the polished surface of official reports, the raw material of the past still murmurs. Archival letters mention discoveries now absent. Early diagrams show tunnels no longer acknowledged. Photographs once said to exist have disappeared from museum collections. Oral histories speak of excavators instructed to restrict information. And each of these fragments, insignificant on its own, begins to accumulate, like sediment settling in layers. With enough layers, the shape of something unseen begins to form. One cannot help but ask why institutions, academic, political, religious, move so consistently toward simplification. Perhaps the simplest explanation is that complexity threatens authority. A past filled with unanswered questions diminishes the authority of those who claim to interpret it. A world where ancient people possessed knowledge we barely comprehend challenges the notion that modern humans represent the pinnacle of understanding. A labyrinth beneath Malta, cut with precision and humming with acoustic design, suggests that ancient minds were not primitive, but simply different, living in worlds modern frameworks cannot easily measure. And acknowledging that difference might require dismantling long-held assumptions about human capability. There is also the psychological dimension. Humans prefer stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. Malta refuses such structure. Its beginnings are missing, its middle is scattered, its end dissolves without explanation. A culture appears, builds with impossible skill, and then vanishes. To accept this without rationalization is to accept that the human story is full of ruptures, moments when knowledge was lost, not gained, and modern society with its faith in progress resists this idea instinctively. Even so, whispers remain, quiet, persistent reminders that history has editors, and editors have preferences. When one reads early excavation notes beside later publications, the transformation is striking. Words like unusual, astonishing, and inexplicable vanish, replaced by ritual, symbolic, or ceremonial. What once was strange becomes merely misunderstood. What once was open-ended becomes closed. It is as though the ancient world has been translated into a more comfortable language, its original complexity muted. Yet the stones do not change. The hypogem remains what it always was, a place where geometry becomes acoustics, where bones appear and disappear, where chambers echo with roots no longer mapped. The narrative shifts, but the limestone stays silent, indifferent to interpretation. And so the quiet question grows. If history is shaped as much by those who record it as by those who lived it, how much of Malta's truth lies not in what was discovered, but in what was deliberately or unconsciously left out? There are stories that end cleanly, with facts assembled and meaning secured, but Malta has never offered the comfort of certainty. Instead, as the path through its stones and shadows winds toward its quiet conclusion, the island seems to exhale a different kind of truth, one made not of answers but of echoes. Echoes that drift upward from underground chambers, ripple across megalithic walls, and linger in myths older than language. Echoes that remind anyone who listens that the past is larger than the frameworks built to contain it. Standing again at the threshold of the hypogem, no longer as a visitor tracing corridors, but as someone aware of the layers beneath. The entire island begins to take on a different shape, not simply as land, but as a palimpsest of vanished worlds, a place where memory has pooled in unexpected places, where remnants of old epochs cling to limestone as if afraid to be forgotten entirely. Malta becomes less a dot on the map, and more a fissure in time itself, a thin place where the ancient world presses close enough to be felt but not fully understood. In this final descent, or ascent depending on how one views the spiral, the pieces encountered so far no longer form fragments, but strands of the same quiet tension. Not a puzzle to be solved, but a melody played an octave too low for easy comprehension. The hypogeum's impossible acoustics, the vanished skulls, the sealed corridors, the strange presence Lois Jessup described in the dim glow of a lantern, the megalithic temples rising abruptly from prehistory like memories preserved in stone, the myths of Sun Suna, walking alone across a landscape that feels as if it belonged to minds far older than recorded time. The geologic upheavals that rewrote coastlines and erased whole cultures, the slow, deliberate editorial hands of empires and institutions smoothing the ancient world into forms they could manage. All of it lingers in the quiet. None of it aligns cleanly, and yet each thread seems to gesture toward a deeper continuity, something beneath the island itself, beneath the silence, beneath the layers of curated interpretation. Something that resists being put into order because its nature is not linear. It belongs to cycles, to rises and disappearances, to civilizations that do not behave as textbooks say they should. It is here, in this soft dissonance, that Malta begins to feel less like an isolated anomaly and more like a surviving doorway. A threshold between epochs whose boundaries have blurred with time. For if the island once belonged to a larger landmass lost beneath rising seas, then its ancient architecture, above and below ground, might be among the few remaining markers of a world that existed before the current human story began. A world where knowledge was held differently, transmitted differently, and lost differently. Some archaeologists quietly acknowledge what official narratives do not. The absence of transitional forms in Malta's temple culture is troubling. Cultures rarely appear fully mature. They evolve slowly, through failures and iterations. Yet Malta's megalithic builders do not exhibit such progression. Their earliest surviving works are already accomplished, already precise, already resonant with astronomical, acoustic, and architectural knowledge. It is as if they carried memory into the island rather than developing it there, as if the island served as a refuge for something fleeing collapse, whether environmental, cultural, or psychological. The idea of Malta as refuge aligns with the subterranean instincts seen across the ancient world. The hypogeum, with its spiraling descent, feels less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary, a place for continuity after rupture. Perhaps the ancestors of Malta's builders survived some older catastrophe, preserving what fragments of knowledge they could through ritual, architecture, and myth. But memory passed down for too long eventually frays. The people who inherited the island's underground may have remembered the forms, but not the meanings. They carved spirals because their ancestors had, without fully recalling what the spiral signified. They descended into chambers not to replicate an original purpose, but because the descent itself felt sacred. Cultural memory, half-lived and half-received, can persist for millennia without ever regaining its original clarity. This fragility may explain the sudden collapse of Malta's temple culture. A society can maintain inherited brilliance only so long before environmental stress or demographic decline breaks the chain. When the strain of climate, isolation, or resource failure exceeded the culture's ability to adapt, the thread finally snapped. The temples fell silent. The hypogeum closed itself. The people who remained no longer carried the memory of the world that had taught their ancestors to build with stone and sound. Later inhabitants, Bronze Age settlers, Phoenicians, Romans, found an island already ancient beyond comprehension. What they encountered were remnants, not origins, and so they filled the gaps with myth, giants, spirits, races of people who came before. Myths that were not invented but inherited, distorted through distance, offered as the only tools available to articulate an unarticulable past. Yet as centuries layered themselves upon the story, institutions took hold, knowledge became formalized, archaeology became professional. And the deep ambiguity that once enveloped Malta's ancient world slowly evaporated beneath the pressure to categorize, to classify, to explain. Skeletons labeled unusual became pathological. Chambers once thought deeper became mismeasured. Voices heard in tunnels were dismissed as imagination. The hypogeum's acoustics were reduced to curiosities. Myths of Sunsuna became stories for children, but limestone does not bend to academic interpretation. The sound of a human voice vibrating at 110 Hz remains the same whether explained or ignored. A missing skull does not cease to exist because a report omits it. A sealed passage does not vanish simply because a later map draws a blank wall across its entrance. And a myth that survives thousands of years rarely does so without carrying some shard of truth, however distorted its form may be. In this final stretch of the journey, the realization settles gently but irrevocably. Malta holds within it a story that no single discipline can entirely claim. No archaeology, not anthropology, not mythology, not geology. The truth of the island is distributed across all of them, like fragments of a broken mirror, each reflecting a part of something once whole. To look directly is to see nothing. To look indirectly, through layers of silence, through carefully held questions, is to sense the outline of a world larger than any single narrative can contain. And so one returns to the hypogeum, not physically, but inwardly, to the chamber where sound stretches itself into other shapes, where darkness holds its breath, where ancient hands shaped stone to cradle memory. One stands at the edge of that silence, aware that the answers are not waiting in the shadows, but woven through the uncertainty itself. Because perhaps the real question is not what Malta is hiding, but what the island has been patiently waiting for someone to notice in the echo beneath its foundations. And if that echo truly belongs to a world older than history, what might it reveal if anyone finally learned how to listen?